Ever been treated unfairly simply because of who you are? This is the story of Zariah Johnson, a pregnant woman whose flight turned into a battle against humiliation and injustice. Her experience wasn't just another day of discrimination. It was a wake-up call for a deeply flawed system. What she did to demand accountability will leave you inspired. Leave a comment with your thoughts, hit like if you believe in justice, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Change starts when we speak up, and her story proves it. The sun hung low over Asheville, North Carolina, its golden light casting a warm glow over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The quiet charm of the city belied its buzzing energy, a harmony of old-town nostalgia and modern ambitions. At Asheville Regional Airport, the summer crowd surged with life. Families juggled luggage, business travelers clutched phones to their ears, and vacationers shuffled along, excitement and impatience in their steps. Inside the terminal, Zariah Johnson adjusted the strap of her overstuffed bag. Her hand instinctively rested on her swollen belly, a gesture as natural as breathing. 7 months along, Zariah wore her pregnancy with a mix of pride and fatigue. She had planned this trip for weeks, meticulously coordinating every detail to ensure she could visit her mother, who had fallen gravely ill. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Pulling it out, she read the text from her brother. "Call me when you land. Mom's resting now, but we'll want to see you right away." Zariah's lips pressed together in a thin line. She could feel the weight of urgency pulling at her resolve. The check-in line moved sluggishly, every beep of the scanner a reminder of time slipping away. When it was finally her turn, she handed her ticket to the TSA agent, a stone-faced man whose gaze lingered a moment too long. "Step aside, ma'am," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Random screening." Zariah hesitated, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. "Random?" she asked quietly. "Yes, ma'am. Standard procedure." Her pulse quickened as she was ushered into a separate area. A female agent patted her down while another sifted through her bag. Each motion felt invasive, deliberate, and unnecessary. Zariah caught a glimpse of the main line, passengers breezing through without so much as a second glance. When she was finally cleared, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Clutching her belongings, she hurried toward her gate, her unease simmering just beneath the surface. The gate area was a hive of activity. Passengers jostled for seats, some scrolling on their phones, others engaging in hushed conversations. Zariah found a chair near the window and sank into it, her thoughts swirling. She tried to shake off the encounter with TSA, but the sting of being singled out lingered. It wasn't the first time, and she doubted it would be the last. When boarding was announced, Zariah stood carefully, joining the line that formed like a slow-moving river. Her boarding group was called, and she shuffled forward, her bag bumping against her leg. The jet bridge was narrow and stifling, the sound of footsteps echoing off its walls. By the time she reached her seat, beads of sweat had formed at her temples. She hoisted her bag, straining to lift it into the overhead bin. It was heavier than she anticipated, and her arms trembled under the effort. "Need help with that?" a man seated nearby asked. Before Zariah could answer, a sharp voice cut through the air. "She'll have to manage it herself," said a woman in uniform. Zariah turned her head to see Cassandra Woods, a flight attendant whose expression could best be described as dismissive. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her perfectly pressed uniform radiated authority. Zariah began, but Cassandra interrupted. "FAA regulations require passengers to stow their own carry-ons. If you can't, you should have checked it at the gate." The man who had offered help stood, his jaw tightening. "It's not a big deal." "Sir, please remain seated," Cassandra snapped. Zariah lowered the bag slowly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She didn't want to make a scene, but Cassandra's tone and posture radiated hostility. The other passengers avoided eye contact, their discomfort palpable. "Fine," Zariah muttered, her voice low. She slumped into her seat, clutching her bag on her lap. Her stomach tightened, not from the baby, but from the knot of frustration coiling inside her. Cassandra gave her a curt nod and walked away, her heels clicking against the narrow aisle. Zariah watched her retreat, an uneasy sense of foreboding settling over her. She wasn't sure what bothered her more, the flight attendant's attitude or the realization that no one around her seemed surprised by it. As Zariah settled into her seat, The awkward tension from earlier lingered like an unwelcome guest. The cabin was alive with the hum of engines, the chatter of passengers, and the rustle of overhead bins being closed. She tried to focus on calming herself, her hand resting protectively on her belly, but the sting of the interaction with the flight attendant refused to fade. The aisle narrowed as Cassandra Woods returned, her sharp heels clicking with precision on the aircraft floor. She paused next to Zariah's row, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Ma'am," Cassandra said curtly, folding her arms, "your bag needs to go in the overhead compartment. It cannot remain on your lap during takeoff." Zariah hesitated, her voice measured but firm. "I tried earlier, but it's too heavy. Could someone—" "FAA regulations state passengers are responsible for stowing their own belongings," Cassandra interrupted. Her tone carried an edge, firm but unnecessarily cutting. "If you can't manage, you should have checked it at the gate." A few nearby passengers shifted in their seats, stealing quick glances toward the commotion. The air seemed to thicken as Zariah considered her options. She looked at the bag, then back at Cassandra. "I understand the rules," Zariah replied evenly. "I'm just asking for some help." Cassandra's eyes narrowed and a faint smirk curled at the corners of her mouth. "We can't bend the rules for everyone who asks. Please ensure it's stored properly, or it will be removed." Before Zariah could respond, the man across the aisle stood, his frustration visible. "I'll help her," he said gruffly, reaching for the bag. Cassandra turned on him immediately. "Sir, please remain seated. It's a safety issue." The man hesitated but slowly lowered himself back into his seat, shaking his head. Zariah felt the heat rise in her cheeks, humiliation mixing with frustration. She clenched her jaw, exhaling slowly through her nose. "It's fine," Zariah muttered, forcing her voice to remain steady. She slid the bag beneath the seat in front of her, even though it barely fit. Cassandra remained for a moment longer, her gaze sweeping over Zariah as if to ensure compliance. Then with a brisk nod, she moved on, her presence leaving a vacuum of unease in its wake. As the flight attendants conducted their final checks, Zariah adjusted her seatbelt and leaned back. The hard, rigid fabric of the seat seemed to amplify her discomfort. Cassandra passed by again, her eyes flickering to Zariah. "Straighten your seat, please," Cassandra said, her voice carrying across the aisle. Zariah blinked, momentarily startled. "It's already straight." "Not enough." "Please adjust it fully upright," Cassandra insisted. Zariah gritted her teeth as she made a show of pressing her seat into position. Cassandra's expression remained unreadable, but the faintest trace of satisfaction lingered in her eyes. The passengers around them were now openly observing the exchange. Zariah could feel their stares prickling against her skin, each glance a subtle judgment. She forced herself to look straight ahead, her fingers gripping the armrest. Minutes ticked by, but the cabin atmosphere grew heavier. The pre-flight announcements did little to distract from the charged silence between Zariah and Cassandra. The flight attendant's footsteps carried a rhythm of authority as she moved through the aisle, issuing commands with a clipped efficiency. Just as Zariah began to think the worst of it was over, Cassandra stopped abruptly beside her seat once more. "Ma'am, if there are any further disruptions, I will have no choice but to escalate this to the authorities." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Zariah's chest tightened as she processed the thinly veiled threat. The term authorities carried an unmistakable weight, a silent acknowledgement of the power imbalance at play. Zariah swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't caused any disruptions." "Good," Cassandra replied, her tone sharp enough to cut. She pivoted on her heel and walked away, leaving Zariah to wrestle with the knot of emotions twisting in her stomach. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the approach of takeoff, but Zariah felt anything but settled. Her hands rested protectively on her belly as she stared out the window, the night sky darkening over Asheville. In her periphery, she noticed Cassandra pause at the galley, glancing back with an expression that could only be described as triumphant. The flight attendant's shoulders straightened, her demeanor radiating confidence as though she had won some unspoken battle. Zariah exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The faint hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane began to taxi to the runway. Zariah sat stiffly in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests. She felt the weight of eyes on her, not friendly or curious, but guarded and judgmental. She had seen those looks before, felt their sting in grocery stores, workplaces, and doctors' offices. It was the silent language of exclusion, of being judged before a word was spoken. She tried to calm her breathing, her mind drifting to moments from her past. In high school, a teacher had once accused her of cheating on a test because her grade was too high for someone who rarely spoke in class. At her first job, a customer had demanded a manager when she politely refused to bend to store policy, assuming she was lying. Each memory gnawed at her, compounding the growing knot of frustration in her chest. Now here she was again, an object of suspicion for simply existing in the wrong space at the wrong time. She rubbed her belly instinctively, a silent promise to her unborn child that they would never feel this kind of isolation. "Excuse me, miss," a calm male voice interrupted her thoughts. Zariah turned to see a man seated diagonally across the aisle. He looked to be in his late 40s, dressed casually in a navy button-down and jeans. His face was kind but serious, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. "I couldn't help but overhear earlier," he said, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. "Are you all right?" Zariah hesitated. The instinct to brush off concern was strong, but the sincerity in his expression softened her defenses. "I'm fine," she replied, though her tone betrayed her unease. "I'm Emery Bennett," he introduced himself, extending a hand briefly before withdrawing it, respecting the limited space. "I'm a journalist. I travel a lot for work. I've seen this kind of thing before." Zariah tilted her head, unsure of what he meant. "I noticed how that flight attendant treated you," Emery continued, his eyes flicking toward the front of the cabin where Cassandra stood. "It's not the first time I've seen someone in her position misuse their authority. I just thought you should know you're not imagining it." Zariah blinked, his words landing heavily. She had assumed she was alone in this experience, but his acknowledgement was both validating and unsettling. Emery held up his phone discreetly. "I've been recording since the gate. I think this could be important." Before Zariah could respond, Cassandra's voice rang out sharply from the aisle. "Ma'am, I need you to sit up straight and secure your seatbelt properly. We're about to take off." Zariah complied, though her seat was already upright. Cassandra lingered, her tone growing louder. "Passengers must follow instructions promptly. It's for everyone's safety." A few passengers turned their heads, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to disinterest. Cassandra's words weren't directed at them, and that was enough to keep them disengaged. Emery leaned closer to Zariah, whispering, "She's trying to make an example out of you." Zariah exhaled shakily. "I'm used to it," she admitted, though the words felt like a surrender. "Maybe you shouldn't be," Emery said, his voice firm. As Cassandra moved to the galley, Emery watched her intently. Something in her demeanor caught his attention, a rigidity in her movements, a calculated sharpness in her tone. He scrolled through the video footage he had captured, replaying the interaction at the gate and on the plane. His brow furrowed as he paused on a particular moment. Cassandra's expression wasn't just stern, it was tinged with something more personal, something deliberate. "Interesting," Emery murmured to himself. "What is it?" Zariah asked, noticing the change in his expression. Emery hesitated. "I think there's more to this than meets the eye," he said carefully, "but I need to double-check something first." Cassandra returned to the aisle, her gaze sweeping over the passengers before landing squarely on Zariah. "If there's any further non-compliance, I'll have to escalate this," she announced loudly, ensuring that every nearby seat could hear. Zariah felt her stomach drop. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the curious stares around her. The power dynamic was painfully clear. One wrong move, and she could find herself removed from the flight altogether. Emery tapped his phone screen again, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't say anything further, but the wheels in his mind were clearly turning. As the plane began to ascend, Zariah gripped the armrests tightly, her thoughts a chaotic swirl. The knot of frustration in her chest was now joined by a flicker of something else. Hope. Emery's presence was unexpected, but for the first time she felt like someone was paying attention. Someone saw her, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person worth defending. The flight had settled into a rhythm, with passengers adjusting to the hum of the engines and the muted lighting of the cabin. Zariah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the pressure of everything that had happened weighing heavily on her. She glanced at the call button above her, but dismissed the thought. The last thing she wanted was to draw more attention. Her throat was dry and she decided she needed water. Summoning her courage, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, trying to move quietly into the aisle. The narrow space between rows felt like a gauntlet as she navigated her way toward the galley. "Excuse me, ma'am." Cassandra's voice cut through the low murmur of the cabin. The tone was unmistakable, firm, authoritative, and designed to stop Zariah in her tracks. Zariah turned to face her. "I was just going to get some water," she said, keeping her voice calm. "You're blocking the aisle," Cassandra said loudly, her eyes narrowing. "Other passengers need to move freely. Please return to your seat." Zariah hesitated, looking around. The aisle was empty except for her. "I'll only be a moment," she replied carefully. "I need you to comply with instructions," Cassandra said, her volume increasing. Several passengers turned their heads toward the exchange. "You're already causing disruptions." Zariah felt the heat rising in her cheeks. "I'm not disrupting anything. I just need—" "Ma'am, I won't ask again," Cassandra interrupted, stepping forward as if to physically block her path. One of the passengers a few rows ahead sighed loudly and muttered, "Why can't she just follow the rules?" Another sitting directly across the aisle frowned. "It seems like she's being singled out," he said under his breath, though his words didn't reach Cassandra's ears. Zariah looked at the second passenger briefly, catching the flicker of sympathy in his expression. But the growing tension in the cabin was palpable, and she felt the invisible lines being drawn, those who judged her and those who began to question why she was being treated this way. From his seat, Emery watched the scene unfold, his phone angled discreetly as he recorded. He leaned toward the passenger beside him, a middle-aged woman wearing glasses. "Did you notice how she's been targeting that woman?" Emery asked quietly. The woman adjusted her glasses and nodded. "I've been on a lot of flights," she said, her voice tinged with discomfort. "This doesn't feel normal." "It's not," Emery agreed. He hesitated before adding, "Why do you think she's only focusing on her?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, her eyes followed Cassandra as the flight attendant hovered near Zariah, her posture rigid and unyielding. Zariah, meanwhile, had returned to her seat, swallowing her frustration as she buckled her seatbelt again. Her thirst remained, but the humiliation weighed heavier. Cassandra returned to her duties, but her sharp glances toward Zariah made it clear the issue wasn't resolved. Each step she took seemed to echo her authority, a reminder of who held power in the cabin. Emery leaned closer to the woman. "This isn't the first time I've seen something like this happen," he confided. The woman hesitated, then spoke quietly. "It's not the first time for her either." Emery straightened slightly, his interest piqued. "What do you mean?" "I've flown this route a few times," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was on one of my previous flights. There was another incident. A passenger of color asked for something, and Cassandra—" She paused, shaking her head. "It wasn't as obvious as this, but it was there." "Did anyone report it?" Emery pressed, his voice steady. "I don't know," the woman admitted. "People don't usually say anything. It's easier not to get involved." Emery's jaw tightened as he processed her words. The pattern was unmistakable, and he knew this wasn't just a case of one bad interaction. Zariah shifted in her seat, her hand once again resting on her belly. She looked out the window, the clouds stretching endlessly beneath them. The weight of the stairs, the judgment, and the outright hostility pressed against her chest. Cassandra passed by again, her eyes meeting Zariah's with a glint of satisfaction. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't professional. It was personal. Zariah's grip on the armrest tightened. The pressure building inside her was almost unbearable, a mix of anger and helplessness. She didn't know what she could do, but she knew she couldn't endure this much longer. The hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop to the tension thickening in the cabin. Zariah sat quietly in her seat, her hands folded protectively over her belly. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Her silence was a shield, but it felt increasingly heavy. She glanced toward Emery, who had his phone in hand, scrolling intently. From his seat, Emery's sharp eyes scanned through the footage he'd recorded earlier. Every detail, every word from Cassandra, painted a picture that was all too familiar to him. His fingers tapped quickly across the screen, and moments later, a search result appeared. A blog post by a former passenger. The post recounted an eerily similar situation. The passenger described a flight attendant who had singled them out, using rules as a weapon rather than a guide. As Emery read further, the pieces began to fall into place. The name Cassandra Woods was mentioned directly, alongside accusations of discriminatory behavior. Unbelievable, Emery muttered under his breath. His jaw tightened as he copied the link and saved it for later. Just then, Cassandra appeared in the aisle again, her presence a jarring interruption. She stopped near Zariah's row, her voice loud enough to carry over the low murmur of the cabin. "Ma'am," Cassandra said with an air of finality, "you're once again failing to comply with safety regulations. I've already spoken to you about this." Zariah looked up, startled. "What did I do now?" "You're not sitting properly," Cassandra replied, her tone dripping with condescension. "Your posture needs to be upright during the entirety of the flight unless you're reclining for sleep." A passenger seated 2 rows behind them, a woman with a scarf draped over her shoulders, spoke up. "She's sitting just fine. Why are you targeting her?" Cassandra turned sharply, her expression cool. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I'm enforcing FAA regulations. It's not up for debate." "It feels like it is," the woman shot back, her voice firm. "I've been watching, and you haven't spoken to anyone else like this." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. A few passengers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from confusion to quiet agreement. Cassandra's face remained impassive, but her jaw tightened. "If you'd like to lodge a complaint, you can do so after the flight. For now, I need everyone to remain compliant with safety protocols." "Or just quiet," the woman muttered, crossing her arms. Emery took the opportunity to lean towards Zariah. "That was unexpected," he whispered. Zariah gave him a small, grateful smile, but her unease remained. Cassandra's words lingered in the air, a reminder of the precarious line Zariah was walking. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," Zariah murmured, more to herself than to Emery. "I don't think you should have to," Emery replied. His tone was resolute, his gaze steady. "But it's your call." Cassandra, clearly unsatisfied with the pushback, pivoted and walked briskly to the front of the cabin. A tense silence followed in her wake, broken only by the occasional shuffle of a passenger adjusting in their seat. Zariah closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Her internal struggle was mounting. She wanted to protect herself and her baby, but the blatant unfairness gnawed at her. Before she could make a decision, Cassandra's voice rang out again. This time, it was sharper, more commanding. "Captain, we have a passenger in noncompliance," Cassandra announced, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "I'll need your assistance." Zariah's eyes snapped open. Her heart pounded as passengers turned to look at her, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. The escalation was immediate and unavoidable. The wheels of the plane screeched against the runway, signaling the flight's arrival. Zariah clutched the armrest, her knuckles pale as the realization sank in. Whatever had started mid-flight wasn't about to end here. Cassandra's loud announcement from earlier still echoed in her mind, and the tension in her chest tightened with each passing second. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Zariah glanced at the window. The warm, welcoming hues of Asheville felt like a cruel contrast to the storm swirling inside her. She just wanted to leave, to get to her mother's bedside without further incident. But the furtive glances from passengers and the sharp gaze of Cassandra as she walked down the aisle hinted that trouble awaited. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cassandra's voice broke over the intercom, saccharine yet sharp. "Please remain seated as law enforcement will be boarding to address an issue. Thank you for your patience." The cabin erupted into whispers. Zariah's heart pounded, her breath shallow as she realized the issue was her. The aisle felt suffocatingly narrow as she sat frozen in her seat, trying to process the escalation of events. "Ma'am," Cassandra said, standing near Zariah's row with a pointed look, "please stay seated until the officers arrive." "What is this about?" Zariah asked, her voice trembling but controlled. "I'm following protocol," Cassandra replied, her tone devoid of sympathy. "You've been flagged for non-compliance. It's not personal. It's safety." Before Zariah could respond, the cabin door opened and 2 uniformed police officers stepped on board. Their presence silenced the murmurs as passengers exchanged uncertain glances. One of the officers approached Zariah with a calm but firm expression. "Ma'am," Could you please step off the aircraft with us? The officer asked. Though his tone was neutral, the implication felt like a branding iron. Zariah's stomach sank. Why? What have I done? She asked, her voice cracking under the weight of her disbelief. Just a few questions, ma'am. It won't take long, the officer replied. Emery, who had been watching closely, stood abruptly. I'll be coming with her, he declared, his phone already recording. His steady voice cut through the tense atmosphere. She has a right to representation, and I've documented everything. The officer paused, considering Emery's words, before giving a curt nod. You can join us, sir. As Zariah rose, she felt every pair of eyes on her. The woman who had defended her earlier gave a subtle nod of encouragement, but most passengers avoided her gaze entirely, unwilling to involve themselves further. Cassandra watched from a distance, her posture exuding confidence. She didn't need to say anything. Her smirk spoke volumes. Walking down the jet bridge felt like walking a plank. The officers led Zariah and Emery to a small, sterile room off the main terminal. The fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Zariah sat in one of the plastic chairs, her back straight and hands clasped tightly in her lap. What's going on? Zariah asked again, her voice firmer this time. The first officer adjusted his notepad. We've been informed of potential safety violations during the flight. This is a standard inquiry. Safety violations? Emery interjected, his voice rising slightly. I have video evidence that proves otherwise. This is a gross misrepresentation of what happened on board. The second officer glanced at Emery, clearly taken aback by his assertiveness. We'll review any evidence you have, he said cautiously, but let's start with the report from the flight crew. While the officers deliberated, Zariah sat silently, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She felt like a criminal, her intentions twisted into something unrecognizable. All she wanted was to reach her mother before it was too late. But now she was trapped in a situation spiraling beyond her control. Emery leaned toward her, lowering his voice. This isn't over, he said. They're trying to intimidate you, but we have the truth on our side. Zariah nodded weakly. She appreciated his support, but the weight of the moment felt crushing. Her mother's fragile health loomed in her mind, a ticking clock she couldn't ignore. Every second wasted here was another moment stolen from what could be their last time together. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers returned. You're free to go for now, he said, his tone more conciliatory. But we'll need to follow up with you about this incident. As Zariah rose to leave, Cassandra passed by the room's glass window, her smirk as present as ever. The sight sent a fresh wave of anger through Zariah, but she kept her composure. There would be a time to fight back, just not now. Emery walked beside her as they exited the room, his phone still in hand. I'll get this out to the press, he said, his voice steady. People need to know what's happening. Zariah barely nodded. Her eyes were fixed ahead, the bustling terminal a blur. She sank into a chair near the gate, her body heavy with exhaustion. The enormity of what had just happened began to settle in, but the gnawing fear of missing her chance to see her mother overtook everything else. Cassandra's figure loomed in the distance, her expression untouched by regret or second thoughts. Zariah looked away, her gaze falling to the floor as she wrestled with her next move. The terminal buzzed with activity, the noise of announcements blending with the chatter of travelers moving through the airport. Zariah sat on the cold plastic chair, her hands resting in her lap. Her thoughts swirled with confusion and frustration. The events on the plane, the humiliation of being escorted off. It was all too much. But the look of defiance on Cassandra's face lingered in her mind, igniting a small but growing flame of determination. Emery returned from a call, his face tight with resolve. He sat down next to Zariah, pulling out his phone. We need to talk, he said, his voice low but insistent. What now? Zariah asked, her tone weary but tinged with curiosity. Emery swiped through his phone, opening an email. I've been digging into Cassandra Woods. Turns out this isn't the first time she's been accused of targeting passengers. Zariah blinked, surprised. What do you mean? I found 2 separate complaints filed against her last year, Emery explained, his tone growing more animated. Both incidents were suspiciously similar. Passengers accused her of being overly aggressive, and using flight regulations to justify singling them out. And in both cases, the complaints were dismissed without any formal action. Dismissed? Zariah's voice rose slightly. Why? That's the interesting part, Emery replied. According to what I've pieced together, the airline is notorious for covering up incidents like this. They'd rather protect their brand than hold someone like Cassandra accountable. To them, it's easier to sweep these things under the rug than risk bad press. Zariah leaned back, the weight of his words pressing down on her. So, it's not just about me. No, Emery said firmly. It's about a system that enables this kind of behavior. Cassandra is just a symptom. The realization hit Zariah like a wave. This wasn't a personal vendetta. It was part of something much larger. The thought made her anger flare, but it also filled her with doubt. Even if that's true, what can I do about it? I'm one person. I just wanted to see my mom before... Her voice trailed off, the unspoken fear hanging in the air. Emery softened, his usual determination giving way to empathy. I get it, he said, but sometimes being that one person is enough to start something bigger. You've already been dragged into this, Zariah. Why not make it count? Zariah's hands tightened around the edge of her seat. She wanted to believe him, but the cost felt too high. If she delayed any longer, she might lose the chance to see her mother altogether. As if sensing her hesitation, Emery leaned closer. Look, I'm not saying it's easy, but you're not alone in this. I've got footage, records, and now people are starting to pay attention. He gestured subtly toward a group of passengers gathered near the gate. Several of them were on their phones, speaking in hushed tones or gesturing animatedly. Zariah recognized one of the women from the flight, the same woman who had spoken up in her defense. She held her phone out, showing something to another passenger, who nodded vigorously. What's going on over there? Zariah asked. Social media, Emery replied with a faint smile. A few people started posting about what happened on the plane. It's picking up traction. Zariah's heart skipped a beat. What if it backfires? What if they twist it and make me look like the problem? They'll try, Emery admitted, but that's why we need to get ahead of it. The truth is on your side, and people are already starting to see it. Zariah hesitated, her mind racing. She hated the idea of putting herself in the spotlight, of inviting more scrutiny into her life. But the thought of letting Cassandra and the airline get away with this, again, gnawed at her. What would I even say? She asked quietly. Start with what happened, Emery said. Your story is powerful, Zariah. People need to hear it. She stared at him for a long moment, weighing her options. The knot in her chest tightened as she thought about her mother, about the fleeting time they might have left. But another part of her, the part that refused to let Cassandra's smirk be the last word, began to stir. Before she could respond, a notification pinged on Emery's phone. He glanced at the screen, then held it out for Zariah to see. It was a tweet, already gaining likes and retweets at an alarming rate. The caption read, "Witnessed something disturbing on my flight today. A pregnant woman being targeted by an unprofessional flight attendant. This needs attention." Zariah stared at the screen, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Her story was already out there, whether she liked it or not. The question now was what she would do with it. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I'll speak out, but we have to move quickly. I can't afford to waste any more time." Emery nodded, his respect for her decision clear in his expression. "We'll make it count." As they stood to leave, Zariah cast one last glance toward the gate. Her resolve was solidifying, but the fear of what lay ahead lingered. Somewhere in the distance, Cassandra's figure loomed near another group of flight attendants, her posture as self-assured as ever. Zariah turned away, ready to face the next step. The terminal lights buzzed faintly overhead as Zariah sat back in her chair, her thoughts tangled in the storm of emotions that had taken over since stepping off the plane. Her body ached, not just from the tension of the day, but from the weight of the decisions ahead. She stared down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her shirt as she wrestled with a question that refused to leave her alone. What should I do now? Emery sat beside her, typing furiously on his phone, his focus unshaken. He occasionally glanced at her, giving her space but ready to jump in if she needed support. Zariah appreciated his presence, even if she wasn't quite ready to say it aloud. For the first time since this ordeal began, she didn't feel entirely alone. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her back to the present. She pulled it out to see a text from her brother. "Mom's asking about you. She's hanging in there, but you need to hurry." The message made her throat tighten. She pictured her mother, frail and waiting, hoping to see her daughter one more time before her condition worsened. Tears pricked at the corners of Zariah's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, unwilling to let herself crumble now. "You okay?" Emery asked gently, breaking the silence. Zariah inhaled deeply, exhaling through her nose. "I don't know," she admitted. "I feel like I'm being pulled in two directions. I just want to see my mom before—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Emery set his phone down, his tone firm but kind. "I get it. Family comes first. But what happened to you today? What's been happening to people like you? It's bigger than just one flight. It's a pattern, Zariah. You have a chance to make them answer for it." Zariah looked at him, her expression weary. "And what if it doesn't change anything? What if I'm just wasting time I don't have?" Emery leaned forward, his voice steady and earnest. "Sometimes it's not about immediate change. Sometimes it's about planting the seed so it doesn't keep happening to someone else. You've already been brave by enduring all of this. Speaking up isn't just for you. It's for the people who don't have the strength or the platform to do it." Zariah's hand instinctively went to her belly, feeling the faint movements of her unborn child. She thought about the life she was bringing into the world, the kind of example she wanted to set. Her mother had always told her to stand up for what was right, no matter how hard it seemed. But the weight of responsibility she now carried felt overwhelming. "What kind of world am I bringing my baby into if I stay silent?" she murmured, almost to herself. Emery's gaze softened. "Exactly," he said. "This is about showing your child, and yourself, that you didn't back down when it mattered most." Zariah closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words sink in. She thought about her mother, about her baby, and about herself. She couldn't shake the image of Cassandra's smirk, the way the flight attendant had seemed untouchable, as if her actions would never have consequences. That image burned in her mind, stoking the fire that had been building in her chest all day. Finally, she opened her eyes and met Emery's. "All right," she said, her voice resolute. "Let's do it. I'll tell my story." Emery nodded, a small smile breaking through his usually serious demeanor. "Good. We'll make sure they can't ignore it." Zariah straightened in her chair, the weight on her shoulders shifting into a different kind of pressure, one that came with a purpose. She wasn't sure how this would end, but she knew she couldn't walk away now. As if on cue, Emery's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening slightly. "Well, that didn't take long," he said, turning the screen towards Zariah. The message was from a contact at a major news outlet. "Airline received the video. They're holding an internal meeting now. Want a statement from your source, ASAP." Zariah's stomach twisted. It was happening faster than she'd expected. The airline was already on the defensive, and she wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. Emery leaned closer. "This means they're taking it seriously, but it also means they're going to try and spin it. We need to stay ahead of them." Zariah nodded slowly, her mind racing with possibilities. "So what's next?" she asked. Emery smiled grimly. "You get ready to face them head on, and I make sure the world hears what really happened." As they stood to leave, Zariah felt a mix of fear and resolve coursing through her veins. This wasn't how she'd imagined her day would go, but she was beginning to realize it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something far greater, a fight for dignity, for justice, and for the future she wanted for her child. Zariah sat in a conference room filled with an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the quiet shuffling of papers. Across the table sat two attorneys, their expressions unreadable, but their postures calculated and confident. The room was sparse and clinical, with a single window letting in a sliver of muted daylight. A faint smell of stale coffee lingered, amplifying the tension that hung thick in the air. To her right, Emery sat with his phone on the table, screen off but ready to capture anything he deemed significant. His presence was steady, a silent reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in this. A woman in a sharp gray suit, the lead attorney for the airline, adjusted her glasses and spoke. Ms. Johnson, thank you for coming today. We'd like to address the recent incident on Flight 362 and gather your perspective. Her tone was polite but clipped, as if rehearsed. Zariah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. All right, she said, her voice steady but guarded. The attorney continued, her eyes scanning a set of notes. Our flight attendant, Ms. Cassandra Woods, has submitted a report stating that you were non-compliant with FAA regulations during the flight. Can you explain your actions? Zariah's heart pounded. She knew this wasn't just about explaining herself. It was about defending her dignity. She glanced at Emery, who gave her an encouraging nod, and then straightened her posture. I wasn't non-compliant, she began. I was singled out. Ms. Woods used her authority to humiliate me in front of the entire cabin. The second attorney, a younger man with a calculated demeanor, leaned forward. Do you have any proof of this? Before Zariah could respond, Emery spoke. We do, he said, his voice calm but firm. I have recorded footage that contradicts Ms. Woods' claims. It clearly shows a pattern of behavior that was targeted and unnecessary. The lead attorney's expression didn't falter, but her pen paused mid-sentence. We'll need to review that footage, she said. You'll get it when the time is right, Emery replied smoothly. But for now, let's talk about the two other complaints against Ms. Woods. I assume you're familiar with those? The attorneys exchanged a glance, and the tension in the room thickened. We're here to discuss the current incident, the woman said, her tone cooling. Zariah felt a flicker of fear rise in her chest. These were professionals, skilled in deflection and control. Could she really stand up to them? The doubt crept in, threatening to unseat her resolve. But then she caught Emery's gaze, steady, unwavering. His confidence bolstered her, and she pushed back the fear. I want to make one thing clear, Zariah said, her voice gaining strength. This isn't just about me. This is about a system that lets people like Ms. Woods get away with treating passengers unfairly. I'm not the first person this has happened to, and I won't be the last if nothing changes. The lead attorney leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. We're committed to ensuring all of our passengers are treated fairly, Ms. Johnson. However, we can't address claims without substantial evidence. Zariah was about to respond when the door opened. Cassandra Woods stepped in, her uniform immaculate, her expression calm but unapologetic. She took a seat at the far end of the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Ms. Woods, the attorney said, thank you for joining us. We're reviewing the events from Flight 362. Cassandra nodded, her gaze briefly flickering to Zariah before settling on the attorneys. I'm happy to provide my account, she said, her tone even and professional. As Cassandra recounted the flight, her version painted Zariah as a difficult passenger, someone who resisted simple instructions and disrupted the crew's ability to ensure safety. Every word made Zariah's blood boil, but she kept her composure, refusing to let her frustration show. When Cassandra finished, Emery leaned forward. That's a convenient narrative, he said, his voice laced with measured skepticism. But it doesn't match what I witnessed, or what others have shared. Others? Cassandra asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Emery smirked. You've seen the posts, haven't you? Passengers from that flight are speaking out. Your version of the story is starting to crumble. Cassandra's expression faltered for a brief moment before she recovered. I stand by my report, she said curtly. The attorneys exchanged another glance, and the lead attorney cleared her throat. We'll need to reconvene after further review, she said, signaling the end of the meeting. Zariah exhaled, the tension in her chest loosening slightly as she stood to leave. Emery followed her out, his phone already buzzing with notifications. As they walked through the terminal, Emery checked one of the messages and stopped abruptly. You need to see this, he said, holding out his phone. Zariah read the text from an unfamiliar number. I'm a civil rights attorney. I saw the footage circulating online. If you're willing, I'd like to represent you in taking legal action against the airline. Let's talk. Her breath caught. The fight she had reluctantly entered was now taking on a life of its own, pulling her further into the spotlight. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Zariah sat in a quiet corner of the terminal, her phone buzzing incessantly on the table in front of her. Notifications flooded in, messages from strangers, articles being shared, and social media platforms lighting up with activity. What had started as a small ripple was now a tidal wave. The video Emery had posted earlier was everywhere. The caption accompanying the footage read, "Pregnant woman targeted on Flight 362. When will airlines take accountability for systemic discrimination?" Within hours, it had amassed millions of views. Comments ranged from outrage to shared experiences of similar treatment, and hashtags demanding justice began trending. Zariah's stomach churned as she scrolled through the reactions. She had never imagined her face and story plastered across screens worldwide. Yet here it was, a moment she hadn't asked for, but could no longer avoid. "Have you seen the latest?" Emery's voice interrupted her thoughts as he approached, phone in hand. "What now?" Zariah asked, her tone a mix of apprehension and exhaustion. Emery slid his phone toward her. On the screen was a breaking news alert. Airline to hold emergency press conference in response to viral video. Below it, a statement from the airline promised a thorough investigation into allegations of misconduct. "They're feeling the heat," Emery said, his satisfaction barely contained. "This is big, Zariah. They wouldn't do this if they didn't think the backlash could damage their bottom line." Zariah's grip on her coffee cup tightened. But what does it really change? An investigation doesn't mean accountability. "That's why you need to speak," Emery said firmly. "They'll try to spin this, make it look like an isolated incident. You have the power to tell the truth." Her mind raced. The thought of standing before a crowd of reporters, exposing herself even further, was terrifying. But as she watched the video again, hearing Cassandra's sharp voice and seeing the dismissive way she had treated her, Zariah knew she couldn't stay silent. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "I'll do it." Hours later, Zariah and Emery stood in a packed conference room. The airline's logo loomed behind a podium where the CEO and other executives were seated. Cassandra sat off to the side, her face composed but tense. Cameras flashed, and reporters jostled for position, their murmurs creating a low hum of anticipation. The CEO stepped up to the microphone, clearing his throat. "We deeply regret the distress caused to Ms. Johnson and any passengers affected by this situation," he began. "We are committed to a full investigation and will take appropriate actions based on our findings." The statement was polished, carefully worded to placate the public without admitting fault. But it wasn't enough. As the CEO continued, Cassandra's name trended alongside the airlines, with growing calls for her dismissal. The tension in the room was palpable. When it was Cassandra's turn to speak, she rose slowly, her face a mask of professional calm. "I understand the concerns raised by this incident," she began, her voice measured. "But I must clarify that my actions were in accordance with airline policy. The environment we work in is high pressure, and decisions must often be made quickly to ensure safety." Her words sparked murmurs among the press. To many, it sounded like she was deflecting responsibility, and the unease in the room grew. Cassandra continued, "I am not here to excuse any perceived shortcomings, but to emphasize the challenges of our profession." Zariah's fists clenched at her sides. She felt the anger rising again, not just at Cassandra, but at the system that allowed this kind of behavior to persist. When the opportunity arose for her to speak, she stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm. "This isn't just about me," Zariah began, her voice clear and steady. "This is about a pattern of behavior that reflects a much bigger issue. What happened to me isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a culture that allows certain people to feel entitled to treat others as less than human." The room fell silent. All eyes were on her as she continued. "No one should have to endure what I did, especially not in a place that promises safety and respect. This isn't just about policy, it's about dignity." Emery, standing nearby, nodded in approval as cameras captured every word. The impact of Zariah's statement was immediate. Reporters scribbled furiously, and questions began flying from the crowd. Then a voice cut through the noise. "Ms. Woods," a reporter called out, directing the question at Cassandra, "do you deny that your actions were influenced by racial or personal bias?" The room froze. Cassandra's expression wavered for the first time, her composure cracking under the direct challenge. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. The silence was deafening, and the tension was almost unbearable. Zariah watched as Cassandra struggled, a mix of emotions flashing across her face: defensiveness, fear, and something that resembled guilt. But no answer came, leaving the question hanging in the air like an unresolved chord. Zariah sat in the quiet confines of her temporary hotel room, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The room was sparsely decorated, with beige walls and generic artwork that did little to distract from the turmoil inside her mind. Her phone sat on the table before her, its screen lit with the message from the civil rights attorney who had offered to represent her. "I can help you make a difference," the message read, "but the road won't be easy." She knew what it meant. Taking legal action against the airline would thrust her deeper into the spotlight. It would mean time, energy, and resources she didn't feel she had to spare. But walking away now felt like betraying not only herself, but the countless others who might face similar treatment if no one held the system accountable. The knock at the door startled her. "It's me," Emery's voice called from the other side. She opened the door to find him standing there, his laptop under one arm and a look of quiet determination on his face. He stepped inside, setting up at the small desk near the window. "I've compiled everything we have," he said, motioning for her to sit. On the screen, a folder titled Case Evidence was open. Inside were videos, passenger testimonials, and copies of past complaints filed against Cassandra Woods. "This is solid, Zariah," Emery said, his voice steady. "With the right legal team, you can force them to take responsibility. This isn't just about Cassandra anymore. It's about the culture that lets people like her act with impunity." Zariah sank into the chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly together. "If I do this, it could delay me getting to my mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can live with that." Emery leaned forward, his expression softening. "I get it. I really do. But this fight, it's bigger than just one person. Your mom would understand that, wouldn't she?" Zariah's eyes filled with tears she didn't want to shed. She thought about her mother's endless words of encouragement, the way she had always told Zariah to stand up for herself and for what was right, no matter how hard it seemed. "She would," Zariah admitted, wiping her eyes. "But it doesn't make it any easier." The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. Emery gave her the space to process, his presence a quiet support. Finally, she took a deep breath and straightened in her chair. "All right," she said firmly. "I'll do it. I'll work with the lawyer and move forward with the case. But we need to move quickly. I can't afford to waste time." Emery nodded, his relief visible. "We'll make it happen." As they began discussing logistics, a familiar name flashed on Emery's phone screen. It was a call from a journalist who had been following the story. "Cassandra's statement just dropped," he said, answering the call and putting it on speaker. The journalist's voice crackled through the line. "She's claiming she acted under the airline's strict policies and had no personal bias. She's essentially shifting the blame to the company's training and expectations." Emery's jaw tightened. "Convenient," he muttered. "But we've got the testimonials and the footage. That narrative won't hold up." "Let me know when Zariah's ready to make her statement," the journalist said before ending the call. Zariah exhaled slowly. "She's trying to save herself," she said, "but she's not taking responsibility for what she did. That's exactly why this can't stop here." The hours that followed were a blur of emails, calls, and strategy sessions. Emery coordinated with the lawyer, shared the evidence, and began connecting Zariah with media outlets interested in her story. Each step brought her closer to the fight she had chosen, but the cost of her decision weighed heavily on her. Then her phone buzzed again. She picked it up, her stomach dropping as she read the caller ID. It was the hospital. Her hand trembled as she answered. "Hello? Ms. Johnson." The nurse's voice was calm but serious. "Your mother's condition has worsened. We recommend you come as soon as possible." The words felt like a blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She ended the call and sat frozen, the room spinning around her. "What's wrong?" Emery asked, concern etched across his face. "It's my mom," Zariah said, her voice breaking. "I have to get to her. I can't lose her, Emery. Not now." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said gently. "You've already made the hard choice to fight for what's right. Now we'll make sure you get to her, too." Zariah nodded, though the tears streaming down her face betrayed the fear and urgency consuming her. The path ahead was clear, but it was far from easy. The room buzzed with anticipation, a hum of murmurs and clicking cameras filling the air as reporters jostled for position. This was the second press conference since Zariah's story went public, but the stakes felt immeasurably higher. The room was larger this time, reflecting the airline's growing desperation to manage the narrative. A sleek backdrop displayed the company's logo, a hollow attempt at projecting calm professionalism. Zariah stood off to the side, her hands steady despite the rapid thumping of her heart. Emery stood nearby, his phone in hand, prepared to document anything that veered from the truth. Today wasn't just about public relations. It was a battle for accountability. As the airline's CEO stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. His tone was carefully measured, his words rehearsed. Thank you all for joining us. We remain committed to addressing the concerns raised in recent days. Safety and respect are our highest priorities, and we are taking steps to ensure all passengers feel secure on our flights. Behind him, Cassandra Woods sat at a table, her posture poised but tense. Her face betrayed no emotion, though Zariah noticed the subtle tightening of her jaw as the CEO spoke. Now, we'd like to invite Miss Woods to share her perspective, the CEO concluded, stepping aside. Cassandra approached the microphone with deliberate composure. First, I want to acknowledge the concerns that have been brought to light, she began. As a flight attendant, my primary responsibility is to ensure the safety of all passengers. Every decision I made during Flight 362 was guided by that principle. Her voice grew firmer. I deeply regret if my actions were misinterpreted, but I must emphasize that I acted within the guidelines provided by the airline. In high-pressure environments, quick decisions are often required to maintain order and safety. The room remained silent, her words hanging in the air. To some, it may have sounded like a reasonable defense, but to Zariah, it felt like a calculated evasion. Zariah exchanged a glance with Emery, who gave her a small nod. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. The room buzzed as cameras swiveled to capture her. Safety, Zariah began, her voice steady, is not a justification for discrimination or mistreatment. Cassandra stiffened, her composed facade faltering slightly. I was not a safety risk, Zariah continued, her voice gaining strength. I followed every instruction. What I experienced on that flight was not about protocol. It was about power being wielded unfairly, and I'm not alone. Her words ignited a ripple through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously, and a few raised their hands, eager to ask questions. Zariah pressed on. This isn't just about me, she said, turning to face Cassandra directly. It's about a culture that allows people in positions of authority to act without accountability. The policies you claim to follow aren't designed to protect passengers. They're being used as weapons against them. The tension in the room was electric. Cassandra's expression hardened, but she didn't speak. Suddenly, a reporter stood and addressed Zariah. What do you say to claims that this was an isolated incident? Zariah's gaze didn't waver. It's not isolated. Since my story went public, dozens of people have reached out with similar experiences. This isn't about one bad flight or one bad day. It's about a system that needs to change. Emery stepped forward, holding up his phone. We've collected testimonies from passengers on other flights and former employees of this airline. The pattern is clear, and it's damning. The reporter turned to Cassandra. Ms. Woods, do you deny that bias played a role in your decisions? Cassandra hesitated, the question cutting through her defense. I acted within the scope of my training, she said, her voice quieter now. Any perception of bias is regrettable. Regrettable, Zariah repeated, her tone sharp. That's not an apology, and it's not accountability. The room erupted in murmurs. The airline's CEO stepped forward again, attempting to regain control. We are taking these allegations seriously, he said. Effective immediately, Ms. Woods will be placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. The announcement sent a wave of reaction through the crowd, but Zariah remained focused. Administrative leave isn't enough, she said firmly. What about the policies that allowed this to happen? What guarantees do we have that the next passenger won't go through the same thing? The CEO faltered, clearly unprepared for the question. We are committed to reviewing our policies. When? Zariah interrupted. How? Words aren't action. The reporters pressed forward, their questions overlapping as the tension reached its peak. Cassandra's carefully maintained composure cracked further, her eyes darting toward the exit as if she were searching for an escape. As the conference concluded, Emery handed Zariah her phone. A notification flashed across the screen, a message from the airline. We will be issuing a formal statement regarding changes to our training programs. Expect an update soon. It's a start, Emery said, his voice cautious. Zariah nodded but remained unsatisfied. It's not enough. The conference room was stark and utilitarian, its walls painted a dull beige that seemed to absorb the tension crackling in the air. Zariah sat at one end of the long table, her hands clasped tightly together. Across from her sat Cassandra Woods, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the stack of papers in front of her. The room was filled with representatives from the airline, legal counsel, and a mediator who sat between the two women, attempting to project neutrality. Thank you both for being here, the mediator began, her voice calm but firm. This is an opportunity to address the situation openly and work toward a resolution that satisfies all parties. Zariah's heart pounded as she nodded. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the reality of being face-to-face with Cassandra brought a wave of emotions she wasn't ready for. Anger, frustration, and an underlying sadness she couldn't quite place. Cassandra shifted in her seat, her carefully constructed composure faltering for just a moment. Then she straightened, her voice steady as she spoke. First, I want to say that I never intended to make anyone feel targeted or uncomfortable. My actions on Flight 362 were based on the guidelines provided to me by the airline. Zariah's jaw tightened. Guidelines don't explain the way you singled me out, she said, her voice steady but sharp. You didn't treat anyone else on that plane the way you treated me. Cassandra's gaze flickered, and for the first time, she seemed genuinely unsettled. I admit, she said slowly, that I may have let personal biases influence my decisions. But it wasn't malicious. The pressure we're under as flight attendants, it's constant. We're expected to handle difficult situations without support, and sometimes that pressure, it gets to you. The room fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a confession. Zariah studied her carefully, searching for sincerity in her expression. Cassandra's voice softened as she continued. I'm not saying it was right, but I've been part of this system for years, and it's built to protect the company, not the people in it. A murmur swept through the room as the airline's legal team exchanged uneasy glances. Cassandra's admission was damning, not just for her, but for the company she represented. It wasn't just a personal failure. It was evidence of a flawed system. Zariah leaned forward, her voice steady but laced with emotion. You say the system failed you, but you used that same system to harm me. You can't claim to be a victim and ignore the damage you've done. Cassandra's face paled, and for a moment she seemed lost for words. Then she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. You're right. The mediator intervened, sensing the rising tension. This is an important moment for reflection, she said. Ms. Woods has acknowledged her part in this situation, but it's clear the issues extend beyond individual actions. We need to consider how the airline's policies contributed to this outcome. The airline's CEO, seated quietly in the corner, finally spoke. We recognize that systemic changes are needed, he said, his voice measured. This situation has highlighted flaws in our training and management practices, and we are committed to addressing them. Zariah's eyes narrowed. Words are easy, she said. What's the plan to ensure this doesn't happen again? What guarantees can you give me and everyone else who's been affected by your policies? The CEO hesitated, and the room grew heavy with expectation. We're in the process of reviewing our policies and will be implementing new training programs, he said. We'd also like to offer you an apology and a settlement as a gesture of goodwill. Zariah blinked, the offer catching her off guard. The settlement was likely substantial, an attempt to quiet her and avoid further legal action. But accepting it felt like letting them off the hook, allowing the system to remain unchanged. The mediator turned to her. Ms. Johnson, would you like to take some time to consider this offer? Before Zariah could answer, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Emery. The public is on your side. Don't let them bury this. She looked back at the faces around the table, the airline executives waiting for her response, Cassandra staring at her with something that resembled regret. The weight of the decision bore down on her. If she accepted the settlement, she could end this fight and focus on her family. But walking away meant leaving the broader issues unresolved, allowing the system to continue unchecked. The room was silent, everyone awaiting her answer. Zariah sat in silence, her heart pounding as the weight of her decision pressed down on her. The room buzzed faintly with murmured conversations and the occasional shuffle of papers. But she focused on the faces of the airline executives across the table. They waited, guarded but expectant, for her next move. "I won't take the settlement," Zariah finally said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. "But I'll consider dropping the lawsuit under one condition." The room stilled. All eyes turned to her, even Cassandra's, who sat quietly at the far end of the table. "I want a public apology," Zariah continued, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the airline's CEO directly. "Not just to me, but to everyone who's been mistreated. And I want your commitment, on the record, to overhaul your policies and implement mandatory training on bias and discrimination for every employee." The CEO blinked, clearly unprepared for such a bold demand. He leaned forward, his expression neutral but his tone careful. "Ms. Johnson, these are significant changes you're asking for. It will take time to implement." "I'm not asking for perfection overnight," Zariah replied firmly, "but I am asking for accountability. Words aren't enough. I need action, and so does everyone else who's ever been made to feel like they didn't belong on one of your flights." A tense silence followed. The mediator shifted in her seat, her eyes darting between the parties as she gauged the room. Finally, the CEO nodded, his shoulders dropping slightly. "If we agree to these terms," he said slowly, "will you formally withdraw your complaint?" "Yes," Zariah said, her tone unyielding, "but the apology and the changes must be public and transparent." The CEO exchanged a glance with his legal team before speaking again. "We can agree to that. A formal announcement will be made within 48 hours, and we will begin rolling out updated training protocols immediately." A wave of relief washed over Zariah, though she didn't let it show. This wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step forward. The mediator nodded, officially concluding the session. As the room began to clear, Cassandra remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Zariah hesitated, then turned to face her. "I hope you use this moment to reflect," Zariah said quietly. "It's not just about what happened to me, it's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Cassandra's eyes flickered with something unspoken, shame, perhaps, or regret. She nodded once, her expression unreadable, before standing and leaving the room without a word. Zariah watched her go, a mix of emotions swirling in her chest. She didn't know if Cassandra's regret was genuine or if it even mattered. What mattered was the change that might come from this moment. 2 days later, Zariah sat in a small studio, the glow of the stage lights warm against her skin. The producer adjusted her microphone as she prepared for a live interview with a major news network. The airline had already released a statement, publicly apologizing and outlining their plans for reform. The response from the public had been overwhelming, with many commending Zariah's bravery for standing up to a corporation and demanding change. Now it was her turn to speak directly to the world. As she waited for the broadcast to begin, Zariah thought about the journey that had brought her here. The fear, the humiliation, the anger, and ultimately, the resolve to make a difference. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she had done everything she could to stand for what was right. The producer counted down from 5, and the camera's red light blinked on. Zariah took a deep breath, ready to share her story and her message with millions. The sun streamed through the windows of Zariah's small living room, casting warm light on the bouquet of flowers sitting on the coffee table. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Zariah could finally breathe. She sat on her couch, her hands resting lightly on her rounded belly. The memories of the ordeal on Flight 362 still lingered, but they no longer held the same weight. Each step she had taken, the confrontation, the negotiations, the interviews, had chipped away at the fear and replaced it with something stronger: purpose. Her phone buzzed on the armrest beside her. It was Emery. "They just wrapped up the press conference," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet excitement. "The airline issued a public apology. It's all over the news." Zariah leaned back, her eyes closing briefly in relief. "What did they say?" "They took responsibility," Emery replied. "Promised sweeping changes to their policies, including mandatory bias training for all employees. They even mentioned your name, commending your courage." "And Cassandra?" "She's been officially terminated," Emery said, his tone firm. "But that's not all. A few more passengers have come forward with their own complaints about her. The airline said they'd investigate those cases too." Zariah didn't know how to feel about Cassandra's fate. A part of her hoped this would be a wake-up call for the former flight attendant, a chance to reflect and grow. But she also knew that the accountability Cassandra faced was necessary. "Thank you, Emery," she said, her voice soft but full of gratitude, "for everything." "You did the hard part," he replied. "I just made sure people saw it." As she ended the call, Zariah felt a deep sense of pride in what they had accomplished. The thought of other passengers, people who might have been ignored, dismissed, or worse, being treated with dignity and respect because of the changes they had fought for, made every struggle worth it. Later that afternoon, Zariah turned on the television to watch the press conference replay. The airline's CEO stood at the podium, his tone measured but genuinely contrite. "We failed to uphold the values we claim to represent," he admitted. "And for that, we sincerely apologize to Ms. Zariah Johnson and to anyone who has ever felt less than safe or respected on one of our flights. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for our company, a commitment to doing better, not just in words but in actions." The cameras panned to the audience, where Emery was seated near the front, his presence a reminder of the role he had played in amplifying Zariah's voice. His name had become synonymous with advocacy in the media, and he had been praised for his relentless dedication to uncovering the truth. As the press conference ended, Zariah turned off the TV and smiled to herself. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a step forward, one she knew would ripple far beyond her own experience. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find her mail carrier holding a stack of envelopes. Among them was a plain white envelope with no return address. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Dear Ms. Johnson, I was on Flight 362, and I want to thank you. At the time, I didn't know how to speak up or what to do, but your bravery has inspired me. Watching you stand your ground and demand justice made me realize that staying silent only helps those who thrive on injustice. I've started speaking out more in my own life, and I owe that to you. Thank you for showing us all what courage looks like." Zariah felt tears well up in her eyes as she read the letter. It wasn't just her fight, it was a fight that had touched lives she hadn't even known about. As she folded the letter and placed it on the coffee table, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice didn't end here. It was a journey, one that she and her unborn child would carry forward. Cassandra Woods sat alone in her small apartment, the blinds drawn to block out the midday sun. Her once pristine uniform hung in the back of her closet, untouched since her termination. The walls that had always seemed cozy now felt stifling, closing in around her as she scrolled through the latest headlines. Her name was everywhere. "Disgraced flight attendant at center of airline scandal," one read. Another headline cut deeper. "The face of workplace bias in the skies." Social media was relentless, filled with hashtags condemning her actions and demanding broader accountability within the airline industry. Her phone vibrated on the table, the notification lighting up with another email, this one from a journalist requesting an interview. She ignored it, just as she had ignored the countless messages from strangers, some laced with anger, others dripping with pity. Cassandra couldn't bring herself to respond. What could she say? What defense could she possibly offer? For the first time in weeks, Cassandra allowed herself to reflect, truly reflect, on what had led her here. It wasn't just about one bad day or one difficult flight. Deep down, she knew it was bigger than that. The implicit biases she had carried for years, unchecked and unexamined, had fueled her actions. The power she once wielded with such confidence now felt hollow, its misuse leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. She closed her eyes, replaying Zariah's words during the confrontation. You can't claim to be a victim and ignore the damage you've done. Those words had haunted her ever since. They were true, painfully so. Cassandra had been so consumed by her own struggles, her workload, the stress of her job, that she had ignored how her actions impacted others, and now she had lost everything. Meanwhile, the airline was scrambling to repair its image. A polished press release announced the launch of a company-wide campaign to address bias and discrimination. Mandatory training programs were being developed, and leadership positions were being restructured to prioritize accountability. The response from the public was mixed. Many applauded the changes, seeing them as a long overdue step toward progress. Others were more skeptical, questioning whether these measures were merely performative. The scrutiny remained relentless, keeping the airline under a harsh spotlight. Zariah, however, had moved on to focus on the broader message. She continued to share her story in interviews and public appearances, not as an act of vengeance, but as a call for systemic change. Her poise and authenticity resonated with people far beyond the airline's customer base. She had become a symbol of resilience and justice, a voice for those who had long felt silenced. But the battle wasn't over. As Cassandra scrolled through the latest news, a headline from a major publication caught her eye. Change or PR stunt. The airline industry's reckoning with discrimination. The article questioned whether the changes announced by the airline would lead to real progress, or if they were merely a band-aid on a deeper wound. Cassandra's chest tightened. She wasn't just the face of her own failure. She had become a symbol of everything wrong with the system she had once served. And yet, in the depths of her regret, she felt a flicker of something unexpected, a desire to change. Not for the public's approval or to reclaim her career, but to find a semblance of self-respect she had long since lost. The studio lights cast a soft glow over Zariah as she sat on the cushioned chair, her hands resting gently on her lap. Across from her sat the host, a well-known journalist whose name was synonymous with fearless storytelling. The set was sleek but understated, designed to keep the focus on the conversation. Cameras were positioned at multiple angles, their lenses trained on Zariah's calm yet resolute expression. "Welcome, Miss Johnson," the host began, her voice warm but professional. "Your story has captivated the nation. Today, we want to hear it directly from you. What inspired you to stand up and fight despite the challenges you faced?" Zariah took a deep breath, her voice steady as she replied. "It wasn't an easy decision. At first, I just wanted to get through that flight and see my mom. But as things escalated, I realized this wasn't just about me. It was about a system that allows people to be treated unfairly because of biases that go unchecked and unchallenged." The host leaned forward, her interest genuine. "Many people in your situation might have stayed silent to avoid conflict. What gave you the strength to speak out?" Zariah's gaze softened. "Honestly, it was thinking about my child. I kept asking myself, what kind of world do I want them to grow up in? Staying silent felt like accepting that this is how things will always be, and I couldn't do that. Not for them, not for anyone." The audience in the studio remained silent, hanging on her every word. The cameras panned to capture her determined expression as she continued. "We all have a responsibility to stand against injustice, no matter how small or big the situation might seem," Zariah said. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without sacrifice. But when we stand together, when we choose courage over comfort, we can create a better world." The host nodded, visibly moved by Zariah's words. "Since your story went public, many have come forward with similar experiences. How does it feel to know that your bravery has inspired others to speak out?" "It's humbling," Zariah admitted. "Hearing from people who face the same struggles, people who felt invisible or powerless, it reminds me why this fight is so important. No one should feel like their voice doesn't matter." The conversation shifted to the broader impact of Zariah's actions. The host highlighted the airline's recent policy changes and the widespread conversations about bias in the service industry. Clips from news broadcasts and social media posts were shown on a screen behind them, underscoring how far the ripples of Zariah's stand had spread. "Your story has sparked a national dialogue," the host said, "but I understand this isn't the end for you. Can you tell us about the next steps you're taking?" Zariah nodded, her expression lighting up with a quiet determination. "I'm working on a project to provide resources and support for people who've experienced discrimination, especially in the service industry. It's a space to share stories, connect with legal and emotional support, and work toward meaningful change. The host's eyes widened with interest. That's incredible. Can you share more details? It's still in the early stages, Zariah said, but the goal is to create a network where people feel seen and heard. I want to help others find their courage, the way I was able to find mine. The room filled with quiet applause, a testament to the impact of her words. The host smiled warmly. Your journey is a testament to the power of resilience and unity. What would you like to say to those watching who might feel powerless in the face of injustice? Zariah looked directly into the camera, her voice firm and unwavering. To anyone who feels like their voice doesn't matter, it does. Change starts with one person, one choice, one moment of courage. You are stronger than you think, and your story can inspire others in ways you might never imagine. Don't be afraid to speak up, because you are not alone. The applause grew louder, and the host thanked her for sharing her story. As the interview wrapped up, Zariah felt a wave of calm wash over her. She had stepped into the spotlight not for recognition, but to ignite change. And in that moment, she knew she had done just that. After the cameras stopped rolling, the producer handed Zariah a folder. Inside was a handwritten letter from a young flight attendant who had seen her story. The letter read, "Ms. Johnson, your courage has opened my eyes. I used to ignore the biases I saw in my workplace because I thought it was easier to stay quiet. But after seeing your fight, I know I have a responsibility to speak out. Thank you for showing me what bravery looks like." Zariah smiled, her resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to everyone who had found their voice because of her story, and this was only the beginning. The sterile scent of the hospital was oddly comforting to Zariah as she sat by her mother's bedside. The beeping of the heart monitor blended with the soft hum of life outside the window. Sunlight poured into the room, casting a golden glow over her mother's frail figure. Despite her exhaustion, there was a peacefulness in the air, a sense of culmination after weeks of uncertainty. Her mother stirred, her eyes fluttering open to meet Zariah's. A warm smile spread across her face. "You made it," she said, her voice weak but filled with unmistakable joy. "I did," Zariah replied, reaching for her hand, "and I have so much to tell you." As the afternoon wore on, Zariah recounted everything that had happened. The confrontation on the flight, the media frenzy, the lawsuit negotiations, and the apology from the airline. Her mother listened intently, her face shifting from worry to pride with each detail. "I'm so proud of you," her mother said softly, her hand squeezing Zariah's. "You've always had this fire in you, this ability to stand tall no matter what. Now the whole world sees it too." Tears welled in Zariah's eyes. "I just wanted to do the right thing. For me, for my baby, for all of us." Her mother's gaze drifted to Zariah's belly, where new life stirred. "You've already given them a better world," she said. "But don't stop here. Keep going. There's still so much left to do." The words settled in Zariah's heart, a seed of resolve taking root. She leaned forward and kissed her mother's forehead. "I promise," she whispered. Later that evening, as Zariah sat in the quiet of her hotel room, her phone buzzed with a new email. The subject line caught her attention immediately. "Invitation to speak at Global Justice Conference." Opening it, she scanned the contents, her heart racing. A renowned human rights organization had reached out, inviting her to be the keynote speaker at an international conference on social justice and systemic change. They wanted her to share her story, not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for progress. Zariah exhaled deeply, the weight of the moment sinking in. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of her fight, it was a call to continue it. Her journey had started as a deeply personal battle, but now it was becoming something much larger. The thought was both daunting and exhilarating. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling a faint kick in response. A smile spread across her face. "We've got a lot to do, little one," she murmured, "but we'll face it together." As she gazed out the window at the city lights, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't known in months. The future was uncertain, but it was filled with possibility. For herself, for her baby, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. And so, Zariah's journey reminds us all of a powerful truth. Change begins with a single voice willing to stand up against injustice. It's not always easy, and the road can be long, but courage has a ripple effect, one that can inspire others to speak up and demand better. What would you do in her shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience and transformation.